Please let us stay.
Understand your reservations about a woman.
The widow said it before the old woman could even ask her name. You have land growing too heavy for one pair of hands, and my children have no door to close before the snow. At the bottom of the porch steps stood 34-year-old Tamsin Vale. She was thin from the road, yet she stood perfectly upright. Beside her, 11-year-old Eli watched the porch with the eyes of a boy who already expected rejection, while 7-year-old Nora buried her cold hands in her mother's skirt. The first north wind of September 1887 swept across the Wyoming grass. It moved softly, but it carried a brutal warning. Winter was coming early. On the porch stood Temperance Quillen, 72 and entirely alone. She had spent a lifetime keeping this land alive, but the frontier was ruthless. It now demanded more than her aging hands could give. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The wind pushed dust against the door. Temperance looked at the children first. Then she looked at the barn, the leaning fence, the silent windows behind her. The widow had not brought a plea. She had brought the truth. Quillen Draw Ranch rested near the broken ridges above the Powder River, where open grass met rough country in winter, always arrived before anyone felt ready. From a distance, the place still looked proud. The barn still stood. The cottonwood still lined the creek. Smoke still climbed from the chimney most mornings. A traveler passing by would have seen a working ranch. Someone who knew the land would have seen something very different. 4 years had passed since Mordecai Quillen, the builder who had shaped every fence line and every outbuilding with his own hands, was laid to rest on a quiet hillside beyond the pasture. Nothing had collapsed overnight. The changes came a little at a time. One blade was missing from the windmill. The 38-foot well demanded more strength with every bucket. Cold air slipped through the north wall of the cattle barn. The root cellar carried too much moisture. The haystack faced the wrong wind. Fence posts leaned a little farther every spring. Temperance still followed the same routine she and Mordecai had built together. The ranch remembered those habits. Her body no longer could. That evening, she settled into Mordecai's old rocking chair on the porch. The land stretched before her exactly as she had loved it for decades. For the first time, it no longer felt like land waiting for orders. It felt like land quietly waiting for someone strong enough to answer them. Back on the porch, Temperance waited without speaking. Tamsin understood the probing nature of that silence. People on the frontier earned trust by telling the truth, even when it hurt. Gathering her resolve, she began to explain. Her husband, Caldervale, had died 3 months earlier after riding into a dry wash to free 2 trapped heifers. A flash flood came without warning. The cattle escaped. Calder did not. Only after his burial did the unpaid cattle debt come due. The creditor claimed the small cabin, the remaining herd, and nearly everything the family had built together. What remained fit inside a single wooden chest. 2 wool blankets, a coil of rawhide, a cloth notebook filled with Calder's careful notes, a small sack holding turnip and bean seeds. Nothing else. For 4 days, Tamsin walked nearly 46 miles, keeping to wagon tracks instead of passing through towns. She refused to let strangers remember her children as beggars. Eli carried his father's notebook against his chest every mile. Nora hugged the seed bag as though it were a favorite doll. On the 3rd night, Eli quietly asked, "Do we still have a home?" Tamsin looked toward the dark horizon before answering. Not yet. As Tamsin's heartbreaking story came to a close, Temperance let the silence linger between them. She had watched too many smooth talkers with tragic tales drift across the frontier. Pity and empty words had never kept a ranch alive. "What can you do?" she finally asked. Tamsin answered without rushing. She wasted nothing in the kitchen. A sack of flour or a handful of beans could last longer in her hands than most people thought possible. She could mend a broken harness with rawhide and new livestock as well as any ranch hand. Poultry never troubled her either. When winter crept through cracked walls, she mixed clay and straw to seal the drafts. If the root cellar turned damp, she knew how to dry it before the potatoes spoiled. And every evening she counted grain, divided hay, and kept a ledger that matched the barn instead of someone's memory. Temperance listened without changing her expression. Then she looked at Eli. "Can you milk?" The boy nodded once. "My father taught me. My hands are small. They'll get stronger." The old woman turned toward Nora. The little girl stood quietly beside her mother while the north wind nudged the kitchen door against its worn frame. Temperance looked back at Tamsin. "I do not keep charity under my roof," she said. "I keep work. If you can work, you can eat here." Tamsin never thanked her with tears. She simply nodded. The weight on her shoulders did not disappear. It shifted just enough to let her stand a little straighter. For the first time in many days, the ground beneath her family no longer felt like it was falling away. Temperance led them through the kitchen and opened the small room behind it. For years, it had served as nothing more than winter storage. Two narrow cots leaned against opposite walls. A wooden crate still held old horseshoe nails, oilcloth, spare lantern glass, and broken harness buckles rested beneath a shelf coated with dust. The room smelled of cedar, lamp oil, and seasons that had already passed. Tamsin thanked her with a quiet nod and immediately went to work. She folded one wool blanket and tucked it tightly along the crack beneath the door where the north wind slipped inside. She placed Nora's cot against the inside wall, the warmest place in the room. Eli dragged his own cot beside the doorway without being asked. "If someone comes," he said softly, "I'll hear them first." Tamsin did not argue. She only pulled the second blanket over both children before blowing out the lamp. Across the house, Temperance lay awake beneath the quilt Mordecai's mother had sewn decades earlier. The ranch settled into its familiar nighttime sounds. Timbers creaked. The wind brushed the porch. Somewhere outside, a loose chain tapped gently against the well frame. Then came sounds the house had not carried in years. Nora coughed once in her sleep. A few moments later, Eli whispered through the darkness, "Will she send us away tomorrow?" There was a pause before Tamsin answered, "Only if we fail the work." Silence returned. Temperance stared at the wooden ceiling above her. She remembered something Mordecai had often said after walking the fence lines. "A ranch dies first at the edges, nobody bothers to inspect." She almost turned toward the empty side of the bed, almost spoke his name. Instead, she closed her eyes and listened. For the first time in years, the old house breathed with more than one lonely soul. Tamsin woke long before the first gray light reached the eastern ridge. She moved quietly through the unfamiliar kitchen, opening cupboards, one at a time. A sack of cornmeal rested beside a crock of dried beans. A small tin still held a little coffee. There was enough lard left for one careful breakfast. She split a few dry cottonwood sticks and coaxed the fire back to life. Soon the stove carried a steady heat instead of yesterday's fading ashes. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the house. Temperance stopped in the doorway. For months, breakfast had been little more than stale biscuits softened with reheated coffee. Cooking for one had slowly become another chore she no longer cared to finish. Tamsin said nothing about it. She filled a bowl and placed it in front of the old woman before serving herself. Instead of sitting at the table, she remained near the stove where she could watch both the fire and her children. Outside, Eli crossed the frosted yard to check the cattle's water trough before anyone asked him to. Inside, Nora crouched beneath the table and discovered an old wooden button coated with dust. She rubbed it clean on her sleeve, walked to Temperance, and placed it beside her bowl. "I think it belongs here," she whispered. Temperance finished every bite without a word. When Tamsin turned back toward the stove, the old woman quietly pulled the small chair closer to the fire. "Nora," she said softly, "come warm your hands." The first week passed without a single dramatic moment. That was how most ranches decided whether someone belonged. Not through speeches, through routine. Temperance never explained her schedule. Tamsin learned it by watching. The grain sacks were always checked before sunset. The barn doors had to be latched the moment the wind shifted north. Water came from the 38-foot well before the afternoon chill settled into the rope. Nothing happened by accident. Outside, Eli gathered eggs every morning, then counted them again before dusk. The numbers never stayed in his head. He scratched them carefully onto a small slate, just as his father had once taught him. Nora followed her mother everywhere, collecting dry kindling and learning which patches of grass stayed damp after cold nights. Tamsin warned her never to step there. Wet ground stole heat faster than people realized. Temperance rarely praised anyone. She watched from a distance. If something was wrong, she corrected it. If it was right, she simply moved on. Late one afternoon, Tamsin stepped into the root cellar and paused. The air carried the faint smell of moisture. She ran her fingers across one stone wall, then reached into her apron for a small piece of chalk. Without saying a word, she drew a short white line beside the damp patch. She intended to see whether the moisture moved over the next 3 days before touching a single board or shovel. The following morning, Temperance noticed the chalk line. She looked at the stone, then at Tamsin. For the first time, she understood something important. The widow did not simply notice problems. She looked for the reason they had begun. 3 mornings later, Orrin Bellwether, a part-time ranch hand who had helped the Quillens through countless branding seasons, guided his bay gelding into the yard as he always did. He expected to find another chore waiting. He did not expect to find the ranch already moving. Tamsin sat beneath the barn awning, repairing a broken harness with a strip of soaked rawhide. She pulled each knot tight without wasting a single inch. When she finished, she returned every awl, needle, and knife to the exact place where she had found them. Nearby, Eli counted the morning eggs before writing the number onto his slate. Orrin watched for a long moment before looking toward Temperance. "They're working here," she said simply. That was all the explanation either of them needed. He had seen plenty of people perform when someone was watching. This woman was working as though no one was. Before climbing back into the saddle, he studied the broad haystack near the western pasture. "The north wind's coming early this year," he said. "If that stack keeps facing the weather, the bottom edge will rot before December." He untied a spare coil of baling twine from his saddle horn and set it beside Tamsin. No compliment followed. She picked up the twine, used it before sunset to secure a loose harness rack, and went back to work. Orrin noticed. He smiled to himself before riding away. The argument began without either woman looking for one. Late that afternoon, Tamsin carried a sack of dried beans into the kitchen and noticed an old leather ledger lying open on the table. She never reached for it. But the pages faced upward, and years of keeping ranch accounts had taught her eyes to notice numbers before words. Hay, grain, feed, winter reserves. She looked away almost immediately. Still, one calculation refused to leave her mind. She waited until supper was nearly finished. Only then did she speak. "At that rate," she said quietly, "the hay ends before the thaw, if the snow stays past March." The room became perfectly still. Temperance slowly lowered her spoon. That ledger had belonged to Mordecai. His handwriting filled nearly every page. It was the last place in the house that still felt entirely under her control. "Do you make a habit," she asked, her voice turning cold, "of reading things that don't belong to you?" Tamsin did not step back. "I wasn't reading your memories." She met the old woman's eyes without raising her voice. "I saw numbers." She paused. "I know what wet hay smells like. I know what hungry cattle look like. Those numbers don't leave enough for both." The words hung in the room. Nora stopped eating. Eli lowered his eyes to his plate. Temperance closed the ledger with a sharp crack that echoed through the kitchen. Nora flinched. Tamsin rested a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. She comforted the little girl. She did not take back a single word. Temperance slept very little that night. Long before sunrise, she pulled on her coat, took her walking stick, and made her way alone toward the haystack beyond the barn. She counted every stack herself. She said nothing to Tamsin until nearly an hour had passed. "Bring your knife." Together they cut open one bale from the lowest edge facing the weather. The outside still looked sound. The center did not. A dull brown ring had already begun spreading through the hay. Temperance rubbed the damp strands between her fingers. She did not argue with what she was holding. Tamsin knelt beside the stack and pointed toward the shallow slope beyond the pasture. "The rain runs straight to the base," she explained. "The north wind keeps the bottom from drying. It loses a little every storm, not enough to notice at first, enough to matter by February." She drew a line in the dirt with a stick. "The new bales should face east. Lift them onto lodgepole poles. Cover the top with a sloped thatch cap. Then cut a drainage trench about 9 inches deep along the low side." Temperance listened without interruption. No apology came. The spoiled hay had already spoken. She looked at the ground for a long moment before handing the shovel to Tamsin. "Show me the trench." By midday, Orrin arrived and helped roll the fresh stack onto the pole base. Eli counted every bale as it moved. That evening, Temperance opened Mordecai's leather ledger once more. She slid the pencil across the table.
Do the new tally right there, son.
"Write the new count,"
See that it's exact.
she told Eli. The boy hesitated only a moment before doing exactly that. It was the first page in the ledger that belonged to the future instead of the past. 2 days after the hay was moved, Tamsin asked to look at the root cellar properly. Temperance stiffened at once. Mordecai had built that cellar with his own hands, stone by stone, in the first hard year of their marriage. To question it felt too close to questioning him. Tamsin seemed to understand. "The cellar was built right," she said. "The ground has changed. That was all. No insult." Inside, the thermometer held near 46 degrees, which should have been safe enough. But the air was wrong. It clung to the walls. Flour sacks had a faint gray bloom. Potatoes near the back shelf had begun putting out pale eyes too early. Tamsin studied the vents before touching anything. The high west vent was too open for the way the wind now moved across the draw. The low east side had no real pull at all. She opened a small lower vent on the east wall, narrowed the west vent with a fitted board, and set a shallow bowl of dry ash near the floor to show how quickly moisture returned. Then she hung burlap strips away from the stone so sacks would not breathe directly against damp rock. Nora placed a flat stone marker outside the new vent. Eli wrote the temperature twice a day. Only 3 days later, the cellar held steady between 39 and 41 degrees. The sour, damp smell had faded. The flour sacks felt dry. Temperance stood in the cool dark and placed her palm against the wall Mordecai had built. For a moment, grief and relief shared the same breath. Changing the cellar had not taken him away. It had helped his work last longer. The first cold wind of October carried more than falling leaves. It also carried opinions. Late that afternoon, Hiram Dodd, a neighboring rancher who measured most things by muscle instead of patience, reined his horse beside the north barn. He watched in silence for a minute. Tamsin pressed fresh clay and straw chinking deep into the narrow gaps between the lower wall boards. Orrin packed the mixture firmly with a wooden paddle. A few feet away, Eli stood outside the closed barn while his mother remained inside. "Can you still see daylight?" she called. "A little," he answered. She packed another handful into the crack. "Now?" "No." Only then did she move to the next gap. Near the chicken shed, Nora tied a strip of coarse sackcloth across the doorway, leaving the upper opening clear. Hiram laughed. "That's nothing but mud for a church mouse," he called. "A ranch needs strong men, not a widow patching the wind." No one answered. Temperance heard every word from the porch. She said nothing. Inside the barn, Tamsin finished the last section before checking the high vent beneath the roof. She left it open. Cold air at the animals' backs was the enemy. Moist air trapped overhead was another. Both had to be managed. Fresh straw followed. spread deep enough to lift the cattle above the cold ground instead of simply covering it. When Hiram finally rode away, the yard grew quiet again. Eli looked toward the road. "Why didn't you tell him he was wrong?" Tamsin brushed the clay from her hands before answering. "Because winter will answer better." The north wind slipped through the cottonwoods. This time, it found fewer places to enter the barn. The first hard frost arrived without warning. Sometime before dawn, Temperance slipped quietly from her bed. She did not want to wake anyone just to draw water. By sunrise, Tamsin found her sitting beside the kitchen stove, one hand wrapped around her left wrist. A faint fever had colored her face, though she insisted it was nothing more than stiff joints. Tamsin brewed willow bark tea and laid a warm cloth across the swollen wrist. Then she walked straight to the well. The problem revealed itself within minutes. The rope no longer ran cleanly through the pulley. Years of rubbing against the wooden curb had frayed the fibers and pulled the line off-center. Every bucket climbed the full 38 feet with more resistance than it should have. The well had slowly become heavier. Not because the water had changed, because the system had. Instead of replacing everything, Tamsin reshaped the setup. She moved the pulley onto a new oak bracket to straighten the pull. She wrapped the worn edge of the well curb with thick rawhide to stop the rope from cutting deeper into the wood. Then she suspended a broad, flat stone from the opposite side of the line as a simple counterweight. By afternoon, the difference was obvious. Eli grasped the rope with both hands and drew a full bucket to the surface without stopping once. Temperance watched from the porch. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she looked from the well to the boy. Helping had not made the ranch weaker. It had made the work possible for hands that would one day replace her own. While the outside of the ranch was slowly coming back to life under Tamsin's hands, inside the house, there were still places locked away in grief. The door had stayed closed for almost 4 years. Nora found it by accident. She wandered down the narrow hallway while Tamsin scrubbed the supper pot and gently pushed against the old latch. The door opened only a few inches. Dust floated through the narrow beam of afternoon light. Inside stood a quilt frame, half covered by a faded canvas sheet. Folded scraps of fabric rested in a basket beside it, exactly where they had been left years before. On a small shelf sat a weathered tin with one word painted across the lid: Mordecai. Near it rested a hand-drawn map of the shelter garden, showing rows of beans, sage, and flowers planted to slow the prairie wind before it reached the house. Temperance appeared almost immediately. "Leave that room alone," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Nora froze. Instead of stepping away, she looked toward the old woman with innocent curiosity. "Did he plant things too?" The question settled into the silence. Tamsin started forward. "I'm sorry." She didn't know. Temperance slowly lifted one hand. "No." She crossed the room herself, picked up the old seed tin, and brushed years of dust from the lid. When she opened it, a few paper packets still rested inside. Calendula, pole beans, sage. She smiled so faintly, it almost disappeared. "Mordecai saved seed," she said softly, "the way other men saved coin." Carefully, she tipped one tiny calendula seed into Nora's open palm. The little girl closed her fingers around it as though it were something precious. Temperance watched without looking away. Some memories were never meant to stay locked inside a room. Some were meant to be planted again. The first week of November brought another visitor. Silas Rook, Temperance's nephew, climbed down from a hired wagon wearing a clean wool coat and polished boots that had gathered almost no mud on the road from Cheyenne. He embraced his aunt politely. Then his eyes settled on Tamsin and the children. Only for a moment. Long enough to decide they were temporary. Inside the house, Silas unfolded maps from a land broker and spoke with quiet confidence. "Railroad buyers are paying well. You're getting older. This ranch is too much for one person. Sell now while it's worth something. His words sounded reasonable. His eyes never once wandered toward the barn, or the well, or the haystack. To him, the ranch existed on paper before it existed on the land. Blood is still blood, he added. Family should look after family. Temperance remained silent. Then, without looking at Silas, she turned toward Tamsin. If the past closes by Christmas, she asked calmly, how many days of feed do we have left? Tamsin looked at Eli. The boy reached for his slate without hesitation. He read the figures aloud. Hay, grain, daily ration, reserve for late storms. Silas listened without speaking. When Eli finished, the room fell quiet. Silas finally nodded toward him. The boy keeps good numbers. Temperance looked directly at her nephew. His name, she said evenly, is Eli. For the first time since arriving, Silas had nothing useful to add. 2 days after Silas returned to Cheyenne, Temperance drove alone into town. She never mentioned the trip to Tamsin. Inside the small law office, Alden Pike, the town attorney, explained a working inheritance agreement. If Tamsin remained at Quill and Draw, cared for the ranch through the seasons, cared for Temperance when age finally demanded it, and kept the land productive, ownership could legally pass to her and the children. Temperance accepted the draft. She did not sign it. Back home, she slipped the folded papers beneath Mordecai's leather ledger. Then she laid the pen beside them and walked onto the porch. Low gray clouds gathered along the western ridge. Winter would read that agreement before she ever did. By mid-November, Quill and Draw moved by a new rhythm. The ranch no longer drifted from chore to chore. It prepared. Tamsin divided the hay into marked sections. Good feed for hard nights. Lesser feed for warmer days. Emergency reserve under canvas, set aside where no one could touch it without saying why. The grain sacks were measured by week instead of guessed by habit. Bedding straw was kept dry and lifted off the dirt floor. Every evening, Eli opened Mordecai's ledger and wrote the day's numbers. At first, his handwriting was large and overly careful, the way children write when they know the page matters. Temperance watched him from the table without reaching for the book. At last, she said, "Write smaller. Paper costs." That was all. It was enough. Outside, Nora pushed little sticks into the garden beds where spring seeds would go. She tied scraps of cloth to each marker so they would not vanish under snow. Orin helped set a rough snow fence from poles and brush along the stretch where the wind cut hardest across the calving side of the barn. Tamsin hung a sackcloth curtain inside the main barn door. She packed more clay straw into the low gaps, left the high vent open, and shifted the water trough away from the direct line of wind. Temperance showed them where the drifts had killed calves 20 winters before. She showed them how low clouds caught on the ridge before a bad storm. She showed them the color of grass that held too much hidden frost. Hiram Dodd rode past near sunset and laughed again, wrapping that barn like a baby. "Are you?" No one stopped working. The ranch was not being wrapped. It was being readied for judgment. The first sign came before the snow. Temperance stepped onto the porch before daylight and stood perfectly still. The clouds rode lower than they should. The wind carried the faint smell of iron. She looked toward the western ridge. It comes tonight. By sunset, the sky had disappeared. Then the blizzard struck. Fast. Hard. Relentless. The north wind searched every board, every corner, every weakness it had found in years before. This time, it found fewer. Snow piled against the brush fence instead of burying the barn door. The drifts climbed higher. The entrance stayed open. Inside the barn, the air was still bitterly cold. But it no longer sliced across the cattle's backs. The clay and straw chinking held. The high vent carried damp air away while the lower walls kept the draft outside. The deep bedding stayed dry. The youngest calves remained on their feet. The water trough formed only a thin rim of ice instead of freezing solid. Below the house, the root cellar held steady between 39 and 40 degrees. The flour stayed dry. The potatoes rested quietly, without sending out pale shoots. Outside, the sloped thatch shed the blowing snow from the haystack. Meltwater drained into the shallow trench instead of soaking the lower bales. Every repair was being tested, one by one. Tamsin organized the work without raising her voice. Orin checked the livestock through the night. Eli carried lanterns, counted the cattle after every round, and entered each number into the ledger before the ink could freeze. Inside the kitchen, Nora fed small pieces of cottonwood into the stove and held Mordecai's seed tin close against her lap. Near midnight, Temperance slipped on packed snow inside the barn and nearly fell. Before she reached the ground, Tamsin caught her. Neither woman spoke. Temperance did not pull away. For the first time in many years, she allowed someone else to carry part of the weight while the storm finished delivering its judgment. The blizzard entered its third day. Visibility stretched no farther than the barn fence. Near noon, a shape emerged through the blowing snow. It was Hiram. His shoulders were bent against the wind. In his arms, wrapped inside his own coat, lay a newborn calf, barely able to lift its head. He reached the porch without a word. "My north wall gave way," he said at last. "The hay got wet weeks ago. 2 calves are gone." He looked down at the one he still carried. "This one's breathing." The laughter was gone. "So bring it in," Temperance answered.
Quickly now.
Nothing more.
All right now, little one.
Tamsin was already moving. Eli, bring the burlap. Nora, warm a kettle. Orin, fresh straw.
Nora,
The driest we've got.
quickly now.
No one wasted time asking questions. The calf was rubbed dry, laid deep into clean bedding, and covered with burlap while warm water was brought a little at a time. The little animal shivered through the night. By dawn, it stood. Outside the barn, Hiram stood quietly before the north wall. His eyes followed the clay and straw chinking that he had mocked only weeks before. He reached out and pressed one finger against the hardened seal. Then he turned toward Tamsin. "What's the mix?" he asked.
Clay to straw mix.
Clay to straw.
I believed it would hold.
No apology came. The question itself had become one. Tamsin explained the proportions, the moisture, and how tightly the mixture should be packed around the lower boards. She never looked toward Temperance while she spoke. Temperance, however, watched her for a long time. Not as a guest, not as a widow who had once asked for shelter. For the first time, she saw someone who already carried the instincts of the next keeper of Quillen Draw Ranch. The storm finally loosened its grip. Snow began melting from the south-facing slopes, and the windmill turned again after Orin fitted a new vane where the old one had broken. A week later, Silas returned. He expected to find exhaustion, failure, perhaps a ranch finally ready to be sold. Instead, Quillen Draw was working. The cattle were alive. Hay still filled the reserve stack. The root cellar smelled clean instead of damp. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney. Silas stepped into the kitchen and removed his gloves. "This place still needs a man to manage it," he said. No one answered immediately. Eli quietly placed his slate beside Mordecai's ledger and opened both. He read the figures in a calm voice. Feed remaining. Calves alive after the blizzard. Egg production before the storm, during it, and after. Days the mountain pass stayed closed. Water drawn from the well. When he paused, Tamsin added only one correction about the grain reserve. Nothing more. Temperance closed the ledger gently. "This ranch doesn't need someone named Rook," she said. "It needs someone who knows where it breathes, where it leaks, and where it goes hungry." Silas looked down at the final line Eli had written. "Calves alive." He searched for an argument. The numbers had already answered every one of them. After Silas rode away, Temperance asked Tamsin to join her on the porch. The late winter sun rested low across the pasture. Without ceremony, the old woman placed a folded document on the table. Mordecai's ledger rested beneath it. "It's a working inheritance agreement," she said. "If you stay, if you keep this land alive, care for it through every season, care for me when I cannot care for myself, and teach Eli and Nora to do the same, Quillendraw will become yours." Tamsin did not reach for the paper. Instead, she unfolded it carefully. She read every page. She asked about outstanding debts, water rights, the cattle brand, fence lines, Orrin's place on the ranch. Temperance's mouth softened into the faintest smile. That was exactly why she had chosen her. "I am not giving you land," she said quietly. "I am giving you work that will outlive me." Tamsin met her eyes. "Then I will not take it lightly." Spring arrived the way it often did on the frontier. Not in a single warm day, but one quiet change at a time. Snow retreated from the southern slopes. Water returned to the creek without flooding, and meadowlarks found their voices again. Quillendraw had done more than survive, it had thrived. The root cellar remained dry. The hay reserve outlasted the final freeze, and the cattle carried better weight than any neighboring herd. The ranch was no longer merely bracing for winter, it was preparing for new life. Orrin shared the story in town without boasting, simply stating the facts. Hiram Dodd's silent apology arrived a few days later in the form of a wagon load of clean, dry straw left beside the barn. There was no note, no words were needed. Actions had become the only language that mattered. Late one afternoon, Temperance rested in Mordecai's old rocking chair, a black wool shawl folded across her shoulders. Across the yard, Tamsin firmly latched the newly repaired barn door. She no longer worked with the careful hesitation of a guest, but with the steady hands of a woman planning for the next year. From the garden, Nora came running, carefully cradling a small clay pot. In the center stood a single, vibrant calendula sprout. "Gran," she beamed, placing it in Temperance's lap. This one came up first. Temperance never corrected the word. Her weathered hand rested gently on the little girl's head. Beside her, Eli paused his pencil for only a heartbeat, before quietly finishing the day's entry in the old leather ledger. The numbers were perfectly balanced. The windmill turned smoothly in the evening breeze. Children's voices drifted across the pasture, and for the first time since Mordecai Quillen's passing, the old ranch no longer belonged to a woman waiting alone in the past. It belonged to a family that had earned its place one season, one repair, and one quiet act of faithfulness at a time.